So today I'm happy to introduce Marilynn Johnson, Lynn, who is a professor at Boston College of History. Today she's presenting about the new Bostonians, which you saw the blurb about. But let me give you a little bit of background. One of the interesting things about Lynn is that she seems to manage to be ahead of the curve, writing academically, doing research and writing about topics which then turn out to be much more important than when she started writing about them. So how many years ago was it you did your police violence book?
It's a little 12 years now, something like
So
that.
12 years ago, she wrote a book on police violence, which of course has become a very hot issue in the past couple of years with Black Lives Matter and so on. And as you know, in the current electoral campaign, immigration has become a big topic. These evil immigrants are ruining our neighborhoods and ruining our economy and taking jobs away and all that sort of thing. So Lynn started working on that topic years ago and has had her book out for about a year now on this topic. So I'd like to have you hear from Lynn Johnson.
Great. Thanks, Stavros. And thanks for the opportunity to come here and speak. I really appreciate it, and I think it's the first time I've gotten to speak at a workplace other than my own. So I wanted to, as I usually start when I talk about this book, 1965 is a key moment, a kind of turning point in immigration in the United States and in the Boston area as well. And the timing, my book actually came out this fall in time for the 50th anniversary of the 1965 Immigration Act, which was signed in October and 1965, and now there was a bit of a historical event about it, so I wanted to have the book coming out timed with that. And this is a scene from the signing of that bill with Lyndon Johnson there in the middle and some familiar Massachusetts faces off to the right. And it was part of this whole wave of immigration, a whole wave of legislation that was passed as part of the Great Society during Lyndon Johnson's term, civil rights legislation and anti-poverty legislation and immigration legislation, which was part of the sort of civil rights ethos. The reason that this legislation was so significant is because it reformed the immigration system that had been set up back in the 1920s, which was a very restrictive immigration quota system. And it was one that favored immigrants from Northern and Western Europe and ended up disfavoring immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe and other parts of the world, particularly Asia, which had been partially excluded under older immigration laws and then was completely excluded based on Asian ineligibility for citizenship under U.S. law. And so this 1965 Act changed that system and set up equal quotas for each country around the world. They were pretty small quotas, in some cases just like 100 or so. But it did allow immigration from across the globe in a smaller, and actually did increase the numbers up to about 160,000 or so, and then would increase it in small ways after that. Now, the other thing about this legislation is that it gave preferences and exemptions for certain kinds of immigrants. So if you had particular skills that were needed in the economy, and typically these were skills in the sciences and engineering and that kind of medicine, you could move to the front of the line. Also, if you became an American citizen, you were foreign born and you became an American citizen, you could bring immediate family members over with exemptions, so you could go around the quotas. And what happened very quickly is that family exemptions became very popular. People got citizenship and they brought family members over, and so the numbers of immigrants coming in actually went up because those family exemption visas were outside of the quotas. This is part of the reason that the 1965 immigration law changed things so dramatically in the country. Frankly, nobody had any idea that this law was going to change things as much as it did. Most of the people in Congress who pushed for this legislation, many of them were second and third generation Italians, Jews, other people whose families had come in the more recent wave of Southern and Eastern immigration. They assumed that the family exemptions would help their families, their relatives, to bring more family members over from the Southern and Eastern Europe, and a small amount of immigration would come from other parts of the world. This would help the U.S. image abroad during the Cold War, because the Soviet Union was always trying to capitalize on the fact that the U.S. Practiced various forms of racial and ethnic discrimination. But it would be a goodwill gesture, but it wasn't really going to change the population. And that, of course, proved to be very untrue. Here in Boston, for instance, the change was staggering. In the 1960s, Boston was an overwhelmingly white Catholic, predominantly Irish Catholic, Irish American town. Today, of course, people of color make up the majority of the population, in large part because of immigration from Asia, Latin America, the Caribbean, and Africa more recently. Boston has always been an immigrant portal. We had many, many immigrants coming in the 19th and early 20th centuries. But the diversity of the immigrant population, the foreign-born population today, is astounding, even in comparison to the peak years of the old immigration. And this is a chart from my book. You can see that in 1910, which was the peak census year of the old immigration, you have basically four groups that made up more than 3/4 of the foreign-born. They were all from Europe or Canada, Ireland, predictably, Italy, Russia, mainly Jews in that time period, and Canadians, both from maritime provinces and French Canadians, Canadians more generally. If you compare this to 2010, though, it's quite remarkable. You have more than 24 groups that make up that same percentage of the foreign-born. And they come from all over the world. The three biggest groups are not from, well, actually, the top 10 groups, at least, are not from Europe. They're China, the Dominican Republic, and Haiti have been the three largest groups historically. But they switch around a little bit, and also significant numbers from Vietnam and El Salvador and Cape Verde. And then after that, you just have, all of these little slices of different groups. And it's made the city much, much more cosmopolitan, and obviously much more multiracial, as people have come from all over the world. And this particular makeup, it continues to change. Every census is a little bit different. We'll be seeing more Africans in the future because some of the groups that came later and are beginning to cash in on as they get citizenship and be able to use the family exemptions, their numbers will increase in the future. So, but similar, great diversity will continue, I think, into the future, unless the legislation changes. As far as the metro area is concerned, similar mixture of people, some slight differences here. You have Brazilians ranking a little bit higher because Brazilians tend to live more in the suburbs than in the city. You also have, same thing with Indians, disproportionately in the suburbs rather than in the city of Boston itself. Cape Verdeans rank a little lower because they tend to be concentrated in the city of Boston, but more or less the same kind of profile. Now, the new immigration is now 50 years old, and we know a good bit about it at the national level. Been a lot of national level studies of immigrants, but we know less about how these immigrants have shaped American life in particular places and cities and metropolitan areas. A lot has been written about this by journalists and by social scientists, kind of snapshots, and I used a lot of Globe articles actually going back into their archive over the last 50 years, which were an important source for me. But But typically these are sort of snapshots of particular immigrant communities or groups and at that particular moment. So you don't get much of a historical perspective. And as a historian, I thought, the new immigration is not so new anymore. It's 50 years old. It's changed. When I was reading about immigration in the 1970s, it looked very different from what we see in the city today. So that's why I decided to write this book. I wanted to tell the story of the new immigration in a particular city, a particular region, to see how it evolved over time and how immigrants helped to shape the region and the city as a whole. And it turned out that Boston was a great place to do that. It's a city that was powered by immigrants in the 19th and early 20th centuries during the industrial era. It's also a city that's been one of the top 10 immigrant receiving areas of the late 20th and early 21st centuries. So it's always been an important immigrant portal. And during this past 50 years, Boston has also experienced a dramatic turnaround in its economy, in its infrastructure. There has been a kind of rebirth, a renaissance of Boston and its economy in this time period. So I wanted to know, what's the relationship between this so-called Boston Renaissance and the new immigration? So as I argue in the New Bostonians, I think that the two are very directly connected, that immigration is very much a part of the bigger story of the Boston Renaissance. Now here, I don't want to oversimplify. There's a lot of things that went into Boston's turnaround. And you can think of globalization, the restructuring of capital, urban renewal, technology, all kinds of important changes. But immigration, I think, is one of the ingredients that has been the least talked about in terms of the contributions to the labor market and the transformation of the city itself and its neighborhoods, its life, that has really been a part of the Boston Renaissance. So I really want to make an argument in this book that we have to really remember the role of immigration and how important it is if we want to really understand the history of the new Boston, which has sort of come into being since the 1960s and especially since the 1980s. So let me give you a few examples of some how I think this is the case. Population replenishment is an important part of the story. As you can see in this chart, I just charted the population in Boston from 1880 to the present. And you can see in the sort of height of the mature industrial era from 1880 until the 1920s, Boston's population was steadily growing, and the foreign-born population in the lighter color of the bar was clearly a big part of that. The native-born population was also growing because lots of people were coming in from rural areas, moving into the cities, and so both populations were important. By 1930, we see a kind of leveling off and a slight decline in the population. A lot of that was due to the Great Depression and how hard Boston was hit in the Depression. A lot of its industries closed down temporarily or permanently. And World War II kind of revived things for a while, but then after the war ended, things declined again. And from 1950, you can see a pretty dramatic drop in the population. Between 1950 and 1970, Boston lost 20%, more than 20% of its population, and many industries and jobs along with that. And it wasn't until 1980 that we start to see the population go up again. And as is quite clear from this chart, it is the foreign-born population, not the native-born population, that's driving the increase. And it's also driving the increase in the labor force, which is key to the reemergence of the turnaround in Boston's economy. It isn't until 2010 that we start to see a slight increase in the native-born population. Now, a good a good part of that increase is actually the children of the foreign-born, who are disproportionately younger. Boston has an aging population, like much of the Northeast and the Midwest. And this foreign-born population is much more concentrated in the 20 to 38 range, more likely to have children, and thus more likely to produce native-born children there. So it's without immigrants, I think it's pretty clear that our population would not be going up. It would be at best flat. Now this is the same idea looking at the labor force. And here you can see again that the native-born labor force since 1980 has been pretty flat in Boston and in Massachusetts generally. It's really the foreign-born population that has driven the growth in the labor force. And if you hear anybody talk about economic development in the state or in the city, keeping the labor force growing at a moderate rate is, a central concern. There's a lot of lamenting about, we have all these college students that come into Boston and they get well educated and they have great skills and then they leave. And how do we keep them here? How do we keep the native-born here who can contribute to the labor force? So there is a net outflow of native-born workers, particularly skilled workers, and it's really only immigration that makes up for that and provides a slight increase in the labor force. So I think both of these trends show how important it is that immigration is not, immigrants coming and taking away jobs and depressing the economy. It's actually contributing to growth in the economy. Now, the places where immigrants are working it really varies. The immigration of the modern era since 1965 consists of many more educated and skilled people coming in than was true in the earlier migration of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. That was overwhelmingly unskilled or semi-skilled workers, most of whom who went into day labor or the manufacturing industries. They were factory workers for the most part. Immigrants coming in today tend to be clustered at the top end and at the bottom end of the labor force. So you have in some of the most important, now that we have a service-based economy rather than a manufacturing economy, you have immigrants who are highly educated, highly skilled, who are concentrated in fields like medicine, technology, as you no doubt know, in education, engineering, a variety of fields which are very important to Boston's economy. But they also make up the largest proportion of people who clean the buildings, who serve the food, who do yard work, who take care of our children, who take care of the elderly. The whole growing number of care industries that are driven very largely by immigrants, many of whom come from the Caribbean, Latin America, and Asia as well. Immigrants have also been important as entrepreneurs. They're not just employees. Many of them are starting their own businesses. Again, I'm sure you're familiar with this. Technology and biotech in particular, there's been a good bit of research on this in Massachusetts, and a very large number of immigrants are involved either solely or in partnerships developing startups and other businesses. And it ranges all the way down to local bodegas and restaurants, right on up to big technology firms and medical instruments and any other businesses you can think of. One of the things that happened that sort of thinking about the care industries and the way that immigrants have become so important to that. In my own writing this book and picking the photograph to go on the cover, which I loved, it's a naturalization citizenship swearing-in ceremony at Fenway Park. They had several thousand people there back in 2007. I love the image because it just showed people from all over the world who were going through this. And I gave a copy of the book to my father, who lives in assisted living in Brookline, where I live. And he was taking it over to show to a friend of his. And the nurse's aide, who was pushing his wheelchair, sees the book and said, "That's my father." And my sister. So, I mean, it's so true that, I mean, just picking this image that I would have stumbled into immigrants right in my own backyard. And I subsequently found out the whole story. I met her and I found out the story of how she and her family came from Somalia via Ethiopia and Pakistan. Took something like 10 years to get the whole family here. They live in Dorchester and Jamaica Plain now. So it's just a great example and reminder of how important immigrants are to all of our lives. And I'm sure I know I see immigrants on both the professional and higher end and the lower ends of the service economy all the time. Now, the other ways in which immigrants have been a strong force in our economy is in terms of community and neighborhood revitalization. And we may not see that so clearly today because things are so built up and gentrified now. But if you go back to the 1960s or the 1970s, maybe there's a few people here who remember Boston in that era. I didn't live here then, but I visited a number of times. And it was a pretty down at the heels kind of declining manufacturing center. And it wouldn't be until the 1980s and 90s that this whole high-tech new world, new Boston economy would take off. And immigrants settled in a lot of neighborhoods that were pretty run down, that were losing population, losing jobs, losing industries, and actually ended up really rebuilding them and turning them around. And Washington Street in Chinatown is a really good example of this. This is a street which in the 1960s was known as the Combat Zone. It was the adult entertainment district, so-called. After Scully Square was torn down in an urban renewal program, the city relocated the adult entertainment district, all the porn theaters and adult bookstores, along the edge of Chinatown, which made residents of Chinatown very unhappy because they had families, and it attracted a less savory element. There was a lot of crime, there was a lot of prostitution, but there didn't seem to be much that people could do about it. The existing Chinatown entrepreneurs didn't really want to try and expand in there. And it wasn't until the 1980s, early 1980s, when refugees came from Vietnam in the so-called boat people crisis. These were mainly ethnic Chinese who had been entrepreneurs in Vietnam and who were leaving in part because of persecution they were facing there. And they came in. They weren't always comfortable settling in Vietnamese neighborhoods like Fields Corner and Chinatown. So they settled kind of on the outskirts of Chinatown. And they began, when they started businesses, and they had been small business owners in Vietnam for the most part, they started buying up the cheapest property they could find, or renting out the cheapest property they could find, which was along Washington Street, starting up small stores and restaurants. And they were the single biggest force for turning around the economy on that street and kind of pushing the combat zone out. And today, there's hardly anything left of that old Washington Street, and what you see now is much more like the picture in 2010 here. This is the same building. You can see the arch there. It's mostly restaurants. It's very much a part of Chinatown now, and it really sort of turned things around to the point where now there's luxury condos and high-rises going up, and people are priced out of there now. But you can see the same transformation in cities, in neighborhoods around the city, as immigrants have come into places like East Boston and Dorchester, Allston, Brighton, Jamaica Plain, Roslindale. I mean, it's a lot of different places you could identify the same phenomenon. And it's also happened in some of the nearby suburbs. We have Somerville, of course, is a great example of this. Not everybody wanted to live in Somerville not that long ago, right? It was mostly immigrants who were moving in as the population was declining. And now, of course, again, it's really taken off, and gentrification has become the bigger threat rather than decline. And as immigrants started businesses, as they bought homes, triple-deckers, just the way earlier immigrant groups had done, they're paying tax dollars to contribute to those local economies. We see a revitalization that just changes the local culture in a lot of ways. Obviously makes it more diverse, but it also revitalizes things. It puts more people on the street. There were a lot of these older industrial suburbs where the downtowns were like ghost towns in the 1970s. After a lot of the bigger manufacturing industries closed up, I'm thinking of places like Everett and Framingham, Malden. These were the downtowns of these suburbs were pretty run down. They were becoming unsafe. There's a sociologist at Harvard who's done a very elaborate study in several cities showing that the presence of immigrants in most cases actually reduces crime. So this gives, it's just the opposite of what people like Donald Trump are arguing, right? And that was clearly the case in many parts of Boston and its suburbs. Now, in the book, I wanted to move beyond the city of Boston and look at greater Boston as a whole, because in the past 20 years or so, maybe even a little bit more, since the late 80s, immigrants have been moving disproportionately to the suburbs rather than the city. And they do this for a number of reasons. One of the big things is that Boston, the city of Boston, has become less affordable, obviously. The initial wave of immigrants that I look at in the late 60s and 1970s, they're going to some of the old parts of the city, Chinatown, the South End, East Cambridge would be looking in the Cambridge case. But very quickly, because of development pressures and gentrification in the 1980s, newcomers start moving out to more affordable neighborhoods, places like Allston, Brighton, East Boston, Dorchester, and also out to the closer in suburbs. And they're investing in these areas and helping to change them. So I wanted to follow this process into the suburbs. I wasn't able to study all of the suburbs. What I did is I picked here's just to show you the diffusion that happens between 1970. You can see immigrants are concentrated, and it's a pretty small number. 1970 was the lowest level of foreign-born population in the history of the 20th century, and it's concentrated around Boston and a few suburbs to the north. 40 years later, it's quite a different story. We have immigrants dispersed around the metro area, and in some cases, places like Malden and Chelsea and Randolph that have pretty high foreign-born populations, a good distance out from the city. Same with Framingham and a few others, Acton. So I wanted to get a handle on why immigrants were going to some suburbs and not to others. So I just started out making a chart. This is a list of suburbs that have a higher percentage of immigrants than the city of Boston itself. And as you can see, it's a pretty good list. And the immigrants are coming from different places. There are different stories behind each city. But in general, what I found is that there were two patterns that seemed to be dominant. One was skilled, educated, professional, managerial class immigrants who were moving to the same suburbs that skilled, educated, professional, native-born residents go to, going there for schools, going there for amenities and nice housing. So you have places like, Lexington and Burlington and some of the sort of suburbs to the west of the city. But you also have a lot of sort of poorer working class suburbs, places like Chelsea, which have been in old industrial cities, which have been taking in immigrants for years. Chelsea used to have the largest Jewish population relative to its size of any city in the country. And later on, as Jews moved out, Puerto Ricans, and then Latino immigrants, particularly Central Americans and later Brazilians and others would move in. And so Chelsea now has the highest foreign-born population in the country. I think it's 43%. Not very far away, Malden has also experienced a huge increase in its immigrant population. It too was an old industrial town and saw a major transformation in the 1980s. And same thing with Quincy. And both Malden and Quincy are connected to Boston by the T, either the red line or the orange line. They were very popular with Asian immigrants, Chinese and Vietnamese, who first moved there in the 1980s and began that revitalization process, and then proceeded to diversify, and both cities take in large numbers of immigrants from all over the world. Quincy has people from, they have Latinos, they have Albanians, they have people from Afghanistan, Iraqis. It's a remarkably diverse place. Same with Malden as well. So you tend to have these higher end suburbs and more working class suburbs, old industrial suburbs, that account for the largest number of immigrants. In between, you do have some middle class areas, but not nearly as many. Framingham is another interesting case. And actually in the book, what I do is I look at 3 different suburbs and their history and try and understand why they became popular with immigrants. I look at Malden to the north. Malden was it was the home of Converse, the Converse factory. It's where the Converse All-Star was made for many, many years. Converse shut down in the 1980s. The city went into a bit of a slide, but because it had the T and the orange line, it was attractive for new immigrants to move in when the housing prices were relatively low, and took off. And Quincy also was an industrial town. It was a shipbuilding center and a granite quarry located there. Both of those industries went down in the late 20th century. And again, Chinese and Vietnamese immigrants sort of started the revitalization there in the 1980s. And then out in Framingham, which I always thought of as, I just think of those big malls out there in Natick and Framingham, the classic post-war suburb. Well, it turns out South Framingham was an old industrial center. It's on the railroad. There was a GM assembly plant there. It was built in the late 1930s and shut down in the 70s. Denison Paper was there, Bancroft Cap and Gown. A lot of big manufacturing industries there, nearly all of which closed down. And so the downtown area really hit bottom. But in the 1980s, we start seeing Brazilians moving to Framingham, and again, bringing about a revitalization of that old industrial part of the community. So there's a correlation between the older immigrants and the older industries and the places where new immigrants are going, but not because they're going for those industries, but because the housing market and the local commercial infrastructure had openings for them, and they became attractive places to go. I got to watch my time here. The other thing I talk about in the book, I talk about nativism, the history of racism and nativism, which is a long, involved topic. I can talk about a little bit in question and answer. I look at religion and churches and religious centers that immigrants founded. And I also look at politics and the rise of what I call the new ethnic politics in the city of Boston. I'll just use my last few minutes here to tell you a little bit about what I found with religion, because this I've found to be one of the most fascinating parts of the story. The revitalization that I've discussed was not only economic and physical, it was also cultural and religious. And I found that immigrants, when they settled in these city neighborhoods or in suburbs, they start new community organizations, they start new churches, new religious institutions. And so in my chapter called the Quiet Revival, I look at how newcomers have helped to revitalize Christianity in the Boston area, both Catholicism and Protestantism. And both Protestant and Catholic churches since the 1960s their native-born congregations have been dwindling. At the same time, The foreign-born congregations that are Christian have been growing quite strikingly as more immigrants came in. So immigrants were refilling the pews, but they were also bringing rather different practices with them, cultural practices from their homeland, and this brings about what sociologists of religion refer to as the de-Europeanization of Christianity, and often a shift to a more evangelical and charismatic style of religious practice. So I look but first at the Catholic Church, then at the Protestant churches, and this process of church sharing, which goes on among both denominations. And within the Catholic Church, you have the development of ethnic apostolates, which are somewhat like the old national parishes that were formed for immigrants in Boston in the 19th and early 20th centuries. But they're somewhat different. They're not new churches that are being built, which was the pattern in the 19th century. They're repurposing older churches and often having ethnic congregations sharing those facilities with native-born groups. And in some cases, in say a city like Chelsea, where you have a very large foreign-born population, you have a whole bunch of ethnic apostolates speaking different languages and different services and masses that are sharing the same building. And so it's a very multicultural mix of groups. Protestants have they're a less top-down, it's a more improvisational kind of pattern, and but they too engage in church sharing. This is a church that I end up talking about a good bit at the beginning of my religion chapter. I became interested in it because it's 3 blocks from my house in Brookline Village, and when I moved there 20 years ago, it was the first Presbyterian church of Brookline, and it looked like any other Protestant church in the area. And over time, I noticed that there were a lot of different uses going on in the church, different groups going there. There was a daycare center in the basement, and then there were it seemed to be other groups and congregations who were there, most notably a Korean congregation. And then a few years later, pretty soon the old First Presbyterian Church of Brookline comes down, and the Korean Church of Boston sign, written in English and Korean, goes up. And I thought, well, there's a story here. I've got to find out what it's about. And I went and met some people at the church, and it was their 50th anniversary in 2003, I guess. And so they had done some writing about this, and they were one of the oldest Asian Christian congregations in New England, and I think certainly the oldest Korean congregation. And I found out that they had started as a prayer group at Marsh Chapel at BU back in the 50s. And they had later, they had grown. They had students who were coming from Harvard and MIT and all local universities. They would all go to BU. And soon they got a pastor. They were able to get space in a nearby church. And they were in Boston for a while. They were in Cambridge for a while. But eventually, in the late 1960s, they landed in Brookline Village, and they've been there ever since. But as their congregation grew very rapidly, with a lot of Korean students and professionals moving into the area and turning to the church not only for religion, but for all kinds of community support purposes and cultural amenities, they came to have a much bigger congregation than the native-born one. And back in sometime in the late 1990s, they renegotiated to take over stewardship of the building. So the Presbyterian church, the First Presbyterians are still there, but now they're in the basement, and they rent space from the Korean Church of Boston. And I found that this is a really common story in many churches. The church sharing, and in some cases actually a change in the stewardship of the building over to the ethnic congregations. So. And of course, this is just one side of the story, because there's also all kinds of new world religions that are brought in, Buddhism, Islam, Hinduism, that are building new religious centers, both in the city and especially in the suburbs. They have a whole story behind them as well that's really fascinating. And also some resistance to those those new religious institutions, particularly among Muslims. And the best known of this, of course, is the Roxbury Mosque, which had major protests around it some years back when they were first breaking ground and building the mosque. So I talk about that story and the rise of an interfaith movement among churches and synagogues here in New England that defended the rights of immigrants to build their religious centers. And I think that's been one of the positive things that's come out of some of those conflicts. So I think I might, no, you know what, let me say one more thing, and then I'll open it up to questions. I've been emphasizing, a lot of the positive things about immigration, and I think there are a lot of positive things. But there are challenges, and the book talks about that as well. And let me just mention a few of them. Nativism and racism, of course, have been a big problem for immigrants, as we're seeing in the present moment, and has been true all along. In the 1980s, in the Boston area, there were some really vicious incidents of violence and racism against Southeast Asian refugees who were moving into the area after the Vietnam War. And we had cases of murder, of arson, of vandalism. It was one of the worst cities in the country for it. In many ways, it was a continuation of the animosity of the busing crisis, but now turned toward immigrants and refugees. But something good did grow out of that episode, and that was a kind of organized political response and community response which I call the rise of multiculturalism. Multiculturalism is one of those things that just sort of happened. I knew it came about sometime in the late 20th century. It wasn't a word that was around much before then. So I learned in writing this book that actually was very much a product of the violence and anti-immigrant sentiments of the 1980s, which were so strong, particularly against Asians in this part of the country and also Latinos in California, that really gave rise to these sort of well thought out efforts to educate people, to provide services for newcomers, and to create these sort of multicultural movements and a whole ethos of multiculturalism, which is still hopefully with us today. There are, of course, problems with repression and deportation that have been growing since 9/11. I talk a little bit about that. But finally, I just want to get back to the Boston issue, which is we have this new economy. Immigrants have been a big part of building that new economy, but yet the fruits of these changes have not been equally shared. And there are many newcomers that are doing well, who have well-paying jobs, have nice homes, live in the suburbs, and are well integrated into Massachusetts society. But there are many others who continue to struggle. And some of the bigger issues in our economy about growing income inequality, patterns of contingent labor, contract labor, entrenched forms of racial segregation, and most importantly for Boston, the lack of affordable housing and the growing costs of higher education are really, really critical for everyone, but especially for immigrants. When we look at new immigrants and we say, oh, why aren't they doing as well as the old immigrants? Why, it's the classic thing, the old immigrants were better, they pulled themselves up by their bootstraps, what's wrong with the new immigrants? Well, in fact, it's more difficult to advance your children up if you come in as an uneducated, unskilled worker, it's quite difficult as the rungs of the middle class are eroding to launch your children up into the upper ranks of the economy if you're dealing with housing problems and you're being forced to live in communities that have very poor education systems and poor services generally, and if you can't afford to go to college. I work with mentoring Boston Public School students, many of them from abroad or their parents from abroad, and many of them are very good students, and they get offered admission to a lot of local universities, including my own. But the financial aid packages they often get would leave them $120,000, $150,000 in debt. that's not a good alternative for most people. And I think unless we're really going to expand our opportunities for public education at a reasonable cost, we're not going to be able to take full advantage of the newcomers and their children coming up now. So I will stop there, and I'd love to hear your questions.
Thank you, Lynn.
So you mentioned busing.
Yeah.
And, I get the impression that back in the 70s, that was a pretty big driver of population dynamics. Obviously, a reaction to earlier immigration, but then white flight, and in some respects, Boston is still kind of recovering from that. What's your take on how that relates?
To immigration?
Yeah.
Or well,
just, to Boston.
yeah, I think. Well, I think white flight is something that had been occurring since World War II and since the the early 1950s. It had a lot to do with the changes in the local property markets that were really favoring the suburbs as highways were built, and the mortgage structure of mortgages really benefited whites who would be moving to new suburban housing. So it's a longer term process, and I think the busing crisis aggravated it and made a sort of dramatic example of a moment when particularly Dorchester and Roxbury saw a lot of native-born whites moving out to places like Quincy and other South Shore suburbs. But in terms of immigrants, I think this was something that was really hard for me to get a handle on, because there is some research going on about this right now where they're interviewing people who were like my age, who were kids during the busing crisis, including those who were foreign-born or from Asian American or Latino families. And their experience in that was kind of unusual in that it didn't really make sense on either. It was an issue that was painted in black and white, and immigrants were not really factored into the equation, because for one thing, we had bilingual education programs that had been established in the 1970s, and we were one of the first states to have bilingual education. And so you needed a certain number of critical mass of students who spoke a particular language in order to be able to have a bilingual program. So these communities, immigrant communities that worked really hard to create bilingual programs, are suddenly being dismantled to send students who were considered perhaps black, but if they're Latino, they might be white, they might be black, there were cases of students from the same family. One child would be sent to one school because they were considered white, and another child would be sent to another school because they were darker and considered black. And so there were a lot of things that had to be worked out around that to preserve bilingual programs. But I think it was a confusing thing for a lot of immigrants. There were Haitians who were, walking down the street and suddenly, attacked by white crowds in South Boston, had no idea, were fresh off the boat, had no idea what was going on and why they were. So I think it was a disorienting time, and we didn't really understand how important immigrants were becoming in taking into account how the busing system was set up.
Could you compare the political opportunities for the 1910 group of immigrants, the Irish and the Italians, et cetera, compared to the immigrants that are coming into Boston now?
Yeah.
If you look at Boston city government, it still looks a little bit more like the 1910 group than it does like the 2000 immigration.
Well, it actually has changed considerably in the last 15 years. It's been very slow to change. And with the exception of the Irish, who, because they spoke English and they were had in very large numbers here and a few other cities, were able to move into politics very quickly. If you look at other groups like Italians and Jews, and it took them a couple of generations to really move into the political system. The Irish tended to control things well, the Yankees and the Irish tended to control things pretty closely in the early 20th century. So politics takes longer. You can change the political culture. I mean, you can change the religious culture, and you can change the workplace and neighborhoods, But changing politics and getting political power takes a while. Not everyone gets citizenship right away. Many people continue to have, the first generation continue to have their loyalties to the homeland. They might have dual citizenship now, but they might be more engaged with the homeland than they are with local politics. It's usually with the second generation that change comes. And that's what we're starting to see now. We now have an Asian American president of the Boston City Council. And so we've had both Latinos and Asian Americans in city government and state government in high positions, as well as Haitians. So it's starting to change. And of course, Boston is a majority non-white city, and I think that's driving some of it as well. But political coalitions have to be built. No single group has the electoral support like the Irish did to sort of just quickly elect people, and that takes time to build those coalitions.
Thank you for coming today.
Sure.
To what extent are the changes in Boston since 1965 representative of changes that are happening in other cities in the country because the legislation is affecting those cities as well? Or what aspects of this are unique to Boston, whether it's the mix of foreign to native born or the high versus low end of the service spectrum, or what things are unique to
That's
Boston?
a great question. And I think Boston is typical of a lot of other cities, and particularly older cities in the Northeast and to a lesser extent the Midwest. But a lot of parallels between New York and Boston. They have similar ethnic mix, some similar patterns in terms of many of the things I discussed. Philadelphia has similarities as well. I think this idea of sort of new wine in old bottles, if you will, as immigrants came in and sort of took over, inherited a sort of older rundown city and rebuilt it, has been happening, across the country, and particularly in the older cities. It's happened in Midwestern cities, some of which are quite depressed, and their leaders there are anxious to get immigrants to come to their city, hoping that there will be this renaissance. But of course, you have to have an economy that has the jobs to attract people there in the first place. Immigrants can open all the small businesses they want, but if people are going to have money to buy things in those businesses, there has to be some real economic development there. Now, in terms of differences, I think Boston obviously is on one end of the sort of knowledge economy spectrum. We probably, along with San Francisco and New York and Seattle, we probably have the most sort of high-tech meds, engineering, science-oriented, and a lot of that has to do with the educational institutions here. And so we do have a higher percentage of people foreign-born in these skilled, highly educated professional positions. I think nationally it's something like a quarter of immigrants. Here in Boston it's more than 30%, so it's significantly higher. What other differences? I'll see if I can think of some more.
Just a quick question.
Sure.
Certainly a lot of the current political rhetoric centers on so-called illegal, I guess undocumented is a more proper word. In your data analysis of the Boston area, what's your analysis of, is there a statistically significant number of
It's actually
undocumented?
Relatively low here.
Yeah.
I think the most recent estimates that have been done for Massachusetts are 1% of the foreign-born population is undocumented. There are places closer to the border where it's more like 6 or 7%. So it's relatively speaking, it's pretty small here. Now, in some groups, those numbers are, Central Americans, for instance, those numbers are much higher, Brazilians as well. And so you're much more likely to find undocumented in certain groups compared to others. But relatively speaking, we have, and why that is, it may be proximity to the border as part of it, but we don't have a particularly large population. And I don't deal with it much in the book. I deal with the problems of the undocumented, but I don't really have data because frankly, it's all an estimate anyway. They go around and they talk to different agencies and make estimates based on, they have formulas for doing this, but it's not like you can count the undocumented population.
All right, thanks again, Lynn.
Oh, thank you.